So, Roger Moorhouse, we're here to do a Buffs in brief because it is 78 years to the day since the death of Jan Masaryk. Murder or suicide? Discuss on March the 10th, 1948. Now, this is a crucial moment
Mm.
in 20th century history and in Cold War history for reasons that we are going to unpick and untangle.
Indeed. It's exciting. This is one of those moments, I suppose, there are many, across Central Europe, and it sort of belongs to that post-war period where the communist dictatorships are in the process of becoming. They don't sort of come, bang on in 1945. They have a gestation, if you like. I mean, it's how much of that is kind of guided by Moscow and not. We don't, it's still disputed. But this is one of those key moments, 1948, Czechoslovakia. He was the Czech foreign minister. And he was found, mysteriously at the underneath the second floor window of his apartment in Prague. A defenestration, yet another defenestration of Prague. Supposedly the third or the fourth in history. But one of the most significant, certainly for the fate of Czechoslovakia in the 20th century. So tell us sort of how we get, both in Czechoslovakia and wider Central Europe, how we get to that place where you've got non-communists still within those governments, and there's still the Stalinists, and Stalin himself is still pulling the strings from Moscow. That's a kind of anomalous situation. How does that all come to pass?
So I think we kind of assume that with hindsight that the kind of Cold War just happens automatically at the end of World War II, but it's actually a sort of drawn out and complicated process. But essentially, there are various phases. Immediately after the war, Stalin effectively hands over the project of kind of communization of his hinterland to local communist parties. And historians disagree whether this was a kind of sincere or cynical move, that these kind of semi-democratic party structures were set up in order to kind of take control. Now, what happens is, of course, astonishingly, Roger Moorhouse, the utopia doesn't just magically appear.
Weird, that.
I know, it's extraordinary. It has this, it's like trying to walk on the path to the moon. The bloody thing just keeps retreating as you splash in the shallows with the shark circling. Anyway, I'll abandon that rather torturous metaphor. So Stalin begins to slightly cement control, and there's various steps in that. He is spooked by the fact that in early 1947, the French and Italian communist parties do pretty terribly democratically, and he's beginning to understand that maybe this is not a process that can't be micromanaged. So in July of 1947, there's a meeting of Common Forum. So all the kind of national communist parties come to Poland, and Stalin's representative there basically lays down the law, and he says, there are two systems in this world, capitalist and socialist, and it's our way or the highway. And actually Jan Masaryk, who is, as you say, at that moment a non-communist within a sort of communist dominated government.
This is the period that is generally described as salami tactics, isn't it, by the Soviets?
Yeah.
So they start off with, as you said, I think there is ideologically, I think they still believe, because they are still believers, that if you create the right conditions, then, like you said, communism will happen, sui generis, it will happen on its own. And also it needs to happen on its own because it can't be seen to be imposed from the outside. So that's a bad look. So they want it to be a sort of a nativist movement to some extent, but, guided by Moscow. So they do set up these, coalition governments, and they basically borrow people who are patsies or can be corrupted or are idealistic or think that they might be able to sort of steer things in the right direction. And Masaryk falls into that latter category. He was the son of the founder of Czechoslovakia, Thomas Masaryk. Again, sons of great men are sometimes kind of quite broken in themselves. He was Masaryk himself, the junior, was very bright, was very clever, intelligent, spoke lots of languages. He'd been ambassador to the UK and then later foreign minister all the way through the war period, actually, from 1940 onwards. He'd been a foreign minister in the Czech government in exile and gone back to Czechoslovakia. So a bit like, actually, the Polish example is Stanisław Mikołajczyk, who went back to Poland post-war and joined the same government, this coalition government with the communists, in the hope that he could kind of steer it in a good direction, that he could be a useful influence. And by the time he realised what was going on, you know, the game was up and he basically had to flee for his life. Masaryk is exactly the same example. So by the time he gets to 1948, like you said, the communists are then cementing their control over those governments for all of those other reasons you mentioned. Then Masaryk is kind of, you know, shitting himself, and he's saying, what do I do now? And he actually is the only one that stays on, isn't he?
He is. But I mean, there's been a series of rigged elections throughout 47, and everybody knows they're rigged and they're watching this horribly. And then, importantly, in June 47, the Americans proposed the Marshall Plan, and the Czechs initially accept the conditions of the Marshall Plan. They want to be part of this. And Stalin summons them all to Moscow, and he says, absolutely not. You are not to accept American money. You're kind of mine, effectively. And Jan Masaryk says, I went to Moscow as a foreign minister of an independent sovereign state. I returned as a lackey of a foreign country.
That's the moment the penny drops.
The penny is dropping all over Europe, I think, at this stage. For Masaryk, things get worse in February 48 because there is basically a coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia. The communists absolutely cement control. He really is at that point. He's carrying on, but everybody around him is saying he's a kind of wretched figure. Like, he had once upon a time been seen as quite jovial. He's quite a kind of happy person. And suddenly he's miserable. He's effectively under house arrest as well. So the Guardian basically said in the last few weeks of his life, he looked older than his 61 years, and weariness characterised his former jovial self. Then on the 10th of March, Robert Moorhouse, he is found dead, as you said at the beginning, outside the Foreign Ministry in Prague. And to this day, there is speculation. Is it suicide or is it murder? And the Czechs have actually reopened the investigation into whether it's suicide or murder quite recently, on the basis that they found some stuff in the British and French archives that kind of tilts towards the murder theory. There's an eyewitness account that he was arguing with people.
Yes, his valet left an account, didn't he, that he was having an argument with three men. Yeah.
And we couldn't find anything to suggest that new investigation has reached any conclusions yet. No. I mean, there have been various investigations over the years, but in one sense, it doesn't really matter for historical purposes. I mean, it mattered to poor Jan Masaryk. But for the history, it doesn't matter hugely, because the reason why we think this is such an important moment in the history of Europe is it's effectively the moment that hope dies, right?
Yeah.
Because all over Eastern Europe, and Central Europe, they'd watched the coup in February 48. They'd watched the kind of cleaning out of non-Stalinist communists and non-Stalinist politicians. He was the last man standing, and everybody across Europe believes that it wasn't suicide, or even if it was suicide, he was driven to it. And his death becomes kind of totemic, I think.
It does. And I wonder, I mentioned before, this is like the third or the fourth, depending on how you count it, the third or the fourth defenestration of Prague. Like, defenestration, as in someone being thrown out of a window, is a really Czech bohemian thing, right? And I just wondered, it just sort of occurred to me there that, you know, it's so symbolic in Czech history. If you look at the most famous one is 1618, which is the beginning of the 30 Years' War. And it starts because these two Czech councillors, bohemian councillors, are thrown out of a window as part of a revolt. And it sparks the revolt that becomes the 30 Years' War. Now, if you were mindful of your Czech history, like Masaryk was, and you were wanting to take your life in the most spectacular way possible, and in the hope that you might, you know, spark some sort of spirit of resistance amongst your own people, wouldn't you throw yourself out of a window?
You might well do. But equally, I mean, we don't even have to look very far for a pattern of, you know, people being thrown out of the window by Russian agents.
Yeah.
This is not unknown in the Russian
Indeed.
Soviet playbook.
Indeed.
So
I suppose my point is, that in a sense it could be either. It could be a very symbolic suicide, or it could be also a very politically symbolic murder.
Either way, his death is seismic, because
completely.
You know, across Europe, people are watching this and thinking, okay, gloves are off.
Yeah.
You know,
This is it.
this is it. And I think, with the Marshall Plan and sort of symbolically, it's a key moment. And in
Yeah.
fact, it's only a week later, I think, that Truman makes a speech that basically, from his perspective, cements the idea of a kind of Cold War
Yeah.
atmosphere. He basically says, I think it's about a week later, he basically says, there is no democracy as we understand it in these countries, and therefore we're ideologically at odds. And
Yeah.
so I think the thing that we imagine to be the characteristic of the Cold War, these two ideological blocks opposed to each other, I think it is quite a symbolic moment in that becoming
Crystallized.
crystallized, yeah, in the minds of the protagonists as well as historians, I think.
Yeah. So 40 years of communism was beckoning from that point on. Now, are there
It's
any book?
probably a good idea to chuck himself out of a window, to be honest, given
Yeah.
40 years of
Yeah,
communism.
it's very true. He saw what was coming. He didn't like it.
Yeah.
Have you got any books to recommend on this?
So my favourite book about this whole period is Norman Naimark's Stalin and the Fate of Europe, which is really good on how all this plays out. Not massively about this death itself, but on the kind of the toing and froing that sort of ends up in the Cold War, rather than this idea that it was a monolithic inevitability right from the offskirts,
Yeah.
sort of start. How about you? Any good books?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of some standard text, really. I mean, Tim Snyder's Bloodlands covers this. I know it's a much bigger book, goes right back into the 1930s, but he covers this as well, and that's a brilliant book anyway. I never miss an opportunity to recommend it. Keith Lowe as well, Savage Continent. I mean, Keith,
Oh yes,
brilliant
Keith's
book.
really good.
Looking at that sort of ragged finish to World War II and everything that came afterwards, how messy it is, which is exactly kind of what we're talking about. So that's very good. On the creation of communist Eastern Europe and how brutal that was, and those sort of political shenanigans that went on. Anne Applebaum's Iron Curtain as well is also really good read. One. So they're three. I mean, nothing absolutely specifically on this, but certainly they will all cover it pretty well, and they'll cover the wider history. So, like you said, it's a really, really significant moment in European history.